Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pi People. We're really glad you're joining us today for our Pi People on the topic of Design for Belonging Creator Community. This is our second Pi People around the topic of inclusive design, and we're thrilled to be talking about it again with you today. I'm Katie. I'm a client director at Idean, and I'm part of our inclusive design practice, and I'll be guiding you through today's event and running our third and final session a bit later on today. There's a little bit of setup, housekeeping to go through before we really get going, so let's get on with that. Now, it's really important for us to try and make all of our events accessible and inclusive here at Idean. So today that means that the captions should be on, and please message us in the chat if they're not there. We're recording it with the captions as well, so that'll be available afterwards. There's a live replay option in YouTube, and it's important to say that this is a safe space. So we've got Ideanists on hand to answer questions in the chat, and we just ask that you're mindful of your comments. But it's really important to say that we're always eager to learn, especially around inclusive design. We're definitely not perfect, but we're really trying. So do send us your thoughts and feedback on how we can make our events more accessible and inclusive, because we'd love to get them. One other thing to mention before we get going is that we're a curious bunch here at Idean, and we always love to see where you're watching us from. So do at us, and also just at us so we know what you think and what you're saying about what we're talking about tonight. So settle in. I hope you're comfy and have some snacks. I'm just going to run you through the plan for tonight. So it's just over an hour-ish, and the speakers we've got this evening, so we've got my colleague Enrico. He's going to kick us off with an introduction on designing for belonging. Then we've got the brilliant Taz talking about building inclusive communities, followed by Helen and our very own Kat talking about how they've grown Why Mums Don't Jump and the community that is around that. And then lastly, I'm going to run a short interactive session. Now look, it's Wednesday afternoon. I don't know where you're watching from. I'm in London. So it's no cameras on, just Mentimeter, but we'd love to get your input on what you think an inclusive design meetup could look like. But I'll talk more about that later. So let's get going and start talking about inclusive design and how designing for belonging has come about. So before I hand over to Enrico, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to inclusive design for those of you that haven't heard us talk about it before. So what is inclusive design? So for us, it's this. It's that products and services are designed so that as many people as is practically possible can use, access, and enjoy them. I mean, that's, to this community, that may sound something that is quite sensible, possibly even obvious, but far too many products and services just cannot be said to do this. And it's not just for the benefit of certain groups when you start talking about inclusive design. So originally, the whole movement came out of accessibility standards, but it's so much more than that. So typically, people have the misconception that inclusive design is for those with permanent disabilities, and like, it absolutely is. And it's broader than that, though. So it's for people with permanent disabilities, but it's also for those people who have temporary impairments, and that's what we call them. So anyone who is listening to this event today could have a temporary impairment at any one time. Anyone could. And what we mean by temporary impairments is something has changed, which means you can't experience a product or service in the way that you typically would. So, for example, you have broken your leg and you're trying to navigate shopping with a basket. I mean, that hopefully you'd have a friend to come and help you, but that would be quite challenging. It could mean that you're on the tube, you're listening to a really engrossing podcast, so much so that you miss the announcement that your stop is closed and you end up going down the line, and then that messes up your being on time for a meeting. My occasional temporary impairments is that a small 3-year-old could come running in behind me at any point today and be in a costume and demand something. So, you know, there's all sorts of different ways that this could manifest. But we believe that by using inclusive design and by designing inclusively, you get a much better experience for everybody and it results in better design. So inclusive design has become very much part of everything that we do here at Idean. Since we set up the practice almost 2 years ago now, it's evolved massively. For those of you who joined last time, we demoed some of the tools that we've developed, Cards for Humanity and the Universal Score, and we can drop those in the chat, the links for people as well if you haven't had a chance to see those before. And they're just part of the arsenal that, you know, we have been working on to ensure that we walk the walk as well as talk the talk. So inclusive design is now touching on a great deal of our client engagements, from pitches to customer research to retros. And we now have inclusive design leads on pretty much every project that we do. The results of that have been good, that we're getting more inclusively designed products and services out and putting that lens over the work that we do, and we're enhancing the awareness of inclusive design amongst our clients. Does mean sometimes we have to have difficult conversations, if I'm being completely honest, but that's because it's not easy. But the outcomes that we're getting absolutely make it worth it. And I think, as I've already said several times, we still feel there's absolutely loads to learn, and we'll continue to try to improve. And as it is evolving constantly, it's been during the past 6 months of projects, 6 months or so, that designing for belonging has become a thing. And I'm now going to hand over to Enrico to tell you a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. So design for belonging. In the last few months, the inclusive design team has been working on different fronts to enrich our communities of practice with new methodologies and tools that would help us design with inclusion, diversity, and vulnerability always front of mind. As part of this journey, we created frameworks to improve the way we conduct research, as well as ideation, co-creation workshops, all the way to designing and evaluating products and services. These tools, you have seen them, Cards for Humanity, Universal Score, and so on. So while this has been a super helpful way to set a solid base, so we could help our clients to put their best foot forward when it comes to designing products and services that are inclusive first. And however, it's not just all about tools and methodologies. So we have also done, basically we ask ourselves, what does it mean to design inclusively? And more profoundly, what does it mean to design something that customers want to be part of? This is the reason why we ask ourselves this, is because we believe that design for belonging is the absolute core of inclusive design. So to facilitate the beginning of a new project and to facilitate the conversation with clients and also with the team, we came up with a short set of principles we can follow, we could follow, you could follow every time you start a new engagement. So it's kind of like we set our base camp to where we can start every design exploration or every new discussion, new project with a client. We can work, I mean, you can work also on these already at the propositional stage of a project. It doesn't have to be necessarily a design phase, because it's simply about designing your product or your proposition, and it's about making your customer feel empowered, accepted, safe, and welcome. So the first principle is about making design decision. So enable the customer. Make design choices that work as enablers, not as constraints. This may sound simple, but it's sometimes just quite hard when you get onto a new project and your client gives you already a long list of constraints that you have to follow. And sometimes it's very difficult to make design choices according to those constraints. So enable your target customer to achieve their goals without unnecessarily excluding others that equally might benefit from your product or your service. Then I think this is one of my favorite. It's like you can enable the customer, but also you have to welcome them into the product. So this means creating accessible entry points so that customers can easily get a piece of your experience. This can be achieved in many ways, but you should make the right choices at the very early stages. So when it comes to the type of experience, the pricing model, the medium that you're using to communicate with them, the technology that you're using, especially, but also one of my favorite and one of these elements that sometimes we don't think enough about is language. And it's not just because English is not my first language, but and it doesn't have to be about simple like translation of English, Italian, or Spanish. But language is important because it comes down to the vocabulary that you're using to talk about your product or to talk about your proposition. It comes down to the tone of voice that you use. Is how many value proposition or how many landing pages you see that the language that the designers have used to describe the product is too technical, it's too complex. And then your customers is reading it and they're just like, yeah, this thing is supposed to solve exactly what, right? Because you're not speaking their language. Then the next one, it's probably one of the, I think it's one of the most important. It's about celebrating difference. Sometimes we are ironing out the differences by making everything neutral. And we should know that this isn't the answer, because making everything neutral, it doesn't necessarily mean that our product is going to be available for everyone. Actually, sometimes it's quite the opposite. So the answer is sometimes taking into consideration the diversity of your customers to the point that you are designing for the edge cases to find the best solution for your product. Sometimes designing for the very edge case gives you that feature that actually makes everyone else, all the other customers, happy as well. So be mindful of that. The next one is then about, it's probably the simplest one, or it's supposed to be the simplest one. It's about encouraging connection without necessarily generating dependencies. So it's about creating a channel to stimulate communication between customers so they can find help and support in each other. They are able to share experiences. They can learn from one another. And also to the extent that they can benefit from each other's resources, trading goods and expertise. It sounds simple. So communication sounds simple, but actually generating the right type of communication between customers is not. So definitely worth to spend some time on that when you're creating your value proposition or your product or services. And finally, the most important, it's probably the principle that kind of wraps them all up. And it's create a sense of community that, again, might sound obvious in theory, not very obvious or not very simple in practice. So we should remind ourselves that the strongest community, just even if you look around your your neighbors, or in a kind of like a sport community, a religious community, or any other type of community. If you explore a bit, you will see that the strongest communities are the ones that are built on the strongest values and foundation. So to create a sense of community around your product is essential to create an environment where good values and good principles can thrive, and customer can actually feel they belong somewhere. So I'm going to leave you with these 5 principles, and I really wanted to end on the kind of sense of community aspect, because this is a great segue for me to introduce our first speaker of the evening. She defines herself as educator, change maker, community builder, and she is here to talk to us about how to build a great community. So let me introduce you to Taz Latif.
Hi, Enrico. Thanks so much for that introduction. I will just share my screen very quickly. It's great to be here. I'm also seeing some familiar names in the chat as well, which is really reassuring. But yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. As Enrico mentioned, my name is Taz, and I don't have a single job title. So thanks for introducing me with all those terms. I'm going to speed through some of the learnings that I've taken from the different communities that I've been a part of. 10 minutes isn't a huge amount of time, but I really welcome people to connect with me afterwards so we can continue to share and learn together. So the first thing I wanted to do is explain that communities come in all different shapes and sizes. They don't have to always be related to work. They don't always have to be related to a single identity. And I've been part of lots of different communities, from spoken word communities to fundraising communities, the fitness community, the startup community in London. Even if these don't have a formal meetup point, some of them are defined by regular meetups, having a very formal Slack channel or a place for everyone to communicate. Others are more of a casual community. So it's just something to bear in mind. The Enroll Yourself community as well, which is a peer-to-peer learning course, the Samsung community of mentors, which I've had the pleasure of being on, and even the education community, as I come from a long line of people that work in education. So I used to be a teacher many years ago. But some of the biggest lessons that I've learned have been from a community that I helped to lead called Islamic Makers. Now, they've just celebrated their 5 years and released an impact report as well, which you can find on their website. And although I'm not part of the core team, Islamic Makers is really close to my heart. And essentially, they're a community of Muslim change makers who upskill and pioneer the world of tech. And it was built to create a safe space, something that Enrico mentioned earlier, to really create belonging and also to share experiences. And it stemmed from the fact that a lot of people that we knew within the tech space who identified as Muslim didn't feel like they belonged. A lot of the tech scene in London at the time, we're talking 5 years ago, was driven by alcohol. It was a very pizza and beer alcohol environment, which isn't for everyone. And for those of you that know, as Muslims, we choose not to drink as part of our faith. So it was very difficult for us to go to these events and feel like we belonged and feel like we had a space or a voice. And so Islamic Makers was born. We've sort of been selling out for the last 2 to 3 years, and a lot of our work stemmed around inclusion events, bringing in specialists, having spotlight for speakers as well, and having panel discussions. And from everything that I've been involved with, from managing the community, building confidence, enabling networks to grow, managing the Slack channels, organizing events, there's lots of things involved with running a community, but I wanted to share the 3 key things that I've learned from all of these incredible groups that I've had the honor to be a part of. Now, the first one is to spread your roots. And that's because nepotism isn't exclusive to paid roles. Now, what I mean by this is that while organic growth is really key, it can leave the door open to nepotism. And look, as humans, it's in our nature to gravitate towards people who look like us, who sound like us, those who validate our experiences. And of course, we're going to build communities centered around particular identities. For example, Black women in tech, or a parent employee resource group within the company that we work in, and key characteristics that really bind us together in our identities within those communities. However, our identities aren't one-dimensional. They're intersectional. We have different layers to our identities. For instance, I'm a Muslim woman who has worked in tech, therefore I fit into Islamic Makers. I'm also a human rights activist, and so I fit into the charitable communities. I'm a qualified spin instructor, please don't ask, and therefore was part of the fitness community once. I've developed strategy for tech accelerators and therefore fall into the startup scene and so on. And the list goes on. So it's really important to remember that we need to spread our roots when we first build a community in order to really serve the communities that we want to help and bring together. Because the common denominator alone that brings us all together isn't the only part of your members' identity. I'll give you an example. At Islamic Makers, the 2 founders were South Asian. And so by default, just through human nature, the group organically grew to a majority of South Asian team members and South Asian community members. Now, it wasn't that we were trying to be racist or exclusive. It just sort of happened. And then we struggled to find female speakers within the South Asian community because, as we know, STEM subjects weren't that popular several years ago. We were later criticized for not having Black representation on our panels and especially our events as well. And that was a double whammy because we understood that anti-Blackness existed in pockets of the South Asian community, and we were doing such a huge disservice to Black Muslims in tech. There wasn't a pipeline problem. We knew that Black Muslims existed. We know that they own spaces within the tech industry. We just didn't have the personal networks to make it happen. Now, one way that we can identify the gaps in our community through something called the Wheel of Power and Privilege. Now, this is an incredible illustration by someone called Sylvia Duckworth, whose Instagram handle is on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So please do check out her work. All credit goes to her for this. And I'm here to tell you a bit of an ugly truth. We all have bias and we all have privilege, right? It just manifests in different ways. And I know that myself, allowing myself to be vulnerable, I felt a sense of resistance rising up inside me when I was first told that I have privilege. Because at the time, I conflated the word privilege with having a comfortable life, and that wasn't necessarily the case. And so I started to unpack. At first, I was like, I'm the granddaughter of an immigrant, 3rd generation to the UK, I'm visibly brown, I'm a Muslim, Islamophobia sometimes works against me. Islamophobia always works against me, that's an understatement. But when I started to unpack my privileges, I decided to plot the dots of my identity onto this wheel of power and privilege. And oh my God, I landed towards the center on so many of the categories. Yes, this wheel is subjective. It can change depending on your age, your geographical location, and so on. But what I'll do is leave you with some food for thought on this. What happens if everyone within your community falls towards the center of this wheel? And feel free to screenshot this. I know the session's being recorded as well, so you're more than welcome. And obviously credit Sylvia Duckworth whenever you use her work. And unpacking our privileges does take time. I deliver lectures to clients across Europe, and I was called out recently on my own privilege of being a native English speaker. So as you can see here, someone said to me, talk about having English privilege. One of the things you can do for us, Taz, is that for those of us that don't have English as a first language, is speak a bit slower. So small oversight on my part, but really big impact on the community I was speaking to. Now, the second thing that I've learned is around safeguarding and how we need to be proactive versus reactive. And it doesn't seem like a big issue when you're building a community, but it can cause problems later. And that's because the momentum of building a community and, focusing on the positive feedback that we get from people who do feel like they belong can sometimes detract us from the preventative responsibilities that we have, like safeguarding. So I'll use another example, again, from Islamic Makers, as it's been the most recent. Islamic Makers are a thriving community of several hundred in the Slack channel. The newsletter goes out to thousands, and our events have sold out for the past 2 years. But it happened really fast, and it was an unpaid additional passion project that we didn't put the right frameworks into in order to protect our members. Now, an altercation happened between 2 individuals. It led to one party being really unhappy with the service and the other party unwilling to pay. And so the situation escalated very quickly in front of the wider community and led us to having to remove someone permanently from the Slack channel and the mailing list for turning abusive and hounding other members for monetary donations. We quickly realized that we didn't have the frameworks to actually handle the situation properly. And feedback from some of our more active members included that we needed a vetting process beforehand. Vetting sounds a bit harsh, but you'll understand what I mean. But ultimately, we needed ground rules before admitting someone into what was meant to be a safe space. We noticed that there were a significant number of people as well who were constantly taking resources, taking time from others, always asking questions, which is a great thing, but they were expecting a lot and giving very little in return, and maybe popping up every couple of months. And we just felt that communities shouldn't be one way. So what we did was eventually set up a more detailed set of community guidelines and an initiation form. We took inspiration from Slack's one, which can be found online. So for example, we asked people what they were hoping to take from Islamic Makers and what they were able to offer, what industry they worked in, and so on. This was then automated through a Slack bot, where the answers that they put into the forms were then posted into a Slack channel titled #introductions once their membership was approved. And not only did that help us vet through those people that can't be bothered to fill out the form, and therefore by default we can assume that they wouldn't have been very active members of the community, but it also allowed us to proactively connect people where there could be impact. So when founders, aspiring founders, came into the community and said, I'm really looking for a co-founder, I'm here hoping I can make the connections for it, as the founding team, we could then put people together and introduce them to try and add value while keeping our members safe. And you can see here from Slack's ones, they've got like an introduction, expected behavior, unacceptable behavior, and then rules of enforcement as well, which was really helpful for us. Now, some basic things that I feel guidelines should always include. And again, there are tons of resources online that can help you with this. Loads of companies have an online policy as well as an in-person one as well. But there's 5 key things. So who you are and what your mission is. This will make it very clear to people who are maybe a little bit confused or aren't sure if they would belong within your community. What your values are as well. And Enrico mentioned values earlier. This is the thread that will bind every member within your community. Who should join? I'll give you an example. As someone who works in inclusion, I often want to join. But prior to working in inclusion, I used to be a recruiter and I was interested in inclusion. But every time I applied for one, they said recruiters aren't welcome here. Now, I didn't take that personally. It's just I understood it was meant to be a safe space and not a place for us to look for potential candidates. Also, a code of conduct as well, what you should and shouldn't do. And also where to go for support, because that's really important. People often don't know who to reach out to. Now, a side note to remember is to allow room for decompression depending on what the nature of your community is, because we all have a responsibility over the psychological safety of our members. Now, the final point that I've learned as I come to the end of this presentation is to scale steady. And that means quality over quantity, which sounds like a cliche. But what I will say is try not to romanticize growth, because if we don't scale our communities in a steady and sustainable way, we will struggle later. And the values of an organization can very quickly dissolve when each member isn't initiated and nurtured properly. And I've seen this happen in scaling startups that I've worked in. Now, take time to get to know your members, ensure they have a solid onboarding, introduce them to other people in the network, constantly ask for feedback from the group as well, because these people are the heartbeat of your community. And when scaling, it's important to build a sustainable model, because after a while, it became impossible for us as the founding team to maintain the Slack channel alone, not even thinking about like the events and securing food sponsorships and thinking about replying to messages and inbound business that we had coming in. Our co-founder, Arfa Farouk, who you can find online, then went on to hire the team of more than 10 plus, all a voluntary team, which really eased the labor on us alongside our day jobs and responsibilities. Now, just 2 quick screenshots I'd like to share with you, taken from a workshop that I run for clients on how to build sustainable communities. But one of the things to remember when scaling sustainably is to identify leaders within your communities. And this is a model we can see here taken from another workshop and a resource online. Now, what you'll see is if people don't engage or they don't feel that they're being nurtured, they often fall onto the downward curve that you can see here under inactive. And that's where we lose a lot of value. If we then want to look at this in a more detailed way, we can look at this community commitment curve with examples of activities that can help us identify members. Again, please feel free to screenshot and read up in your own time. And just to wrap up, in order for us to build inclusive communities, we need to remember that access is key, especially in the spirit of inclusive design, which takes me to these illustrations. Some of us may have seen these before. Equality is treating everyone the same. Equitably, when we're being treated equitably, equity is when each person is given the right level of support they need in order to thrive at the same level. But actually what we should be aiming for is a third picture, which is removing all of those barriers and not having to worry about people having different levels of support because those barriers to access have been removed. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn as well.
Taz, thank you so much for sharing all your learnings with us today. I couldn't screenshot quickly enough, but you have some, that was really, really interesting to share, to hear the experiences that you've been through as you've been building these communities. We've got a couple of questions, if that's all right.
Yes. Sure.
And if anyone has any questions for Taz, please drop them in the chat now. I've got a couple of minutes to ask her. And whilst you're putting your questions in, Imogen's just posted that. I've got a question whilst we're waiting for the others. So what channels do you encourage for feedback when you're working in this? So what I mean is that how do you encourage an open dialogue basically, and what are the best channels to encourage that?
Yeah, sure. I think that's dependent on so many things, to be honest, Katie. Like when you're a smaller group, we used to have a WhatsApp group for some of the volunteers. It soon became unsustainable. Like we just couldn't respond to everything. We couldn't keep up with the conversation. So I think when you're smaller, you should look for more intimate ways to receive feedback, things that are a bit more personable, easy ways for people to reach you, because the most likely thing will be is that the community members that join you really early on will most likely adopt a leadership position later on to help you sustain the community. So it's really important to nurture those relationships. And then as you scale, I think a more formal process is probably better suited depending on what the nature of your community is. Having separate channels in Slack, for example, having a dedicated email. So at Islamic Makers, we had a separate email. And all inbound sort of queries would come into that. And that just meant we could protect ourselves as community founders to make sure we weren't becoming overwhelmed, and we could actually park the email when we felt it was getting too much, rather than having it on WhatsApp on our phone where it's constantly pinging. So doing what's best to protect both the community members and the founders.
Yeah, nice. And I think you touched on how you get the right people in the community in terms of setting up those guidelines, which is really interesting. The Slack example, the Slack case study was really interesting as well. I suppose once that's a good way for vetting people. As you said, vetting sounds quite extreme, but asking the right questions to make sure you're getting the right people in. But so I suppose the question is, how do you keep a community inclusive that isn't not necessarily open to everyone as it progresses? So you have that vetting bit at the start, but then as it goes on, how does that work once the members are already in?
Yeah, again, quite a tough one. I can think of one specific example from Islamic Makers, and because it was set up to create a safe space for Muslims in tech, our events were open to everyone. So anyone could come along and come and hear from our inspirational speakers, because the speakers worked in all different organizations. They had different backgrounds. We didn't solely have Muslim speakers. We had speakers from everywhere. The point was to build confidence within the Muslim community. And so while the Slack channel was exclusively for Muslims, because we wanted people to be able to come into the Slack channel. We had a journalist join once, and we didn't feel comfortable with it because then members weren't sharing as much. And we said, hey, like, what's going on? And they said, look, we don't want to mention anything about our workplace, and we don't want to talk about any grievances that we've had or any microaggressions that we faced, because there are XYZ people in here, it might go somewhere, which is such a fair point to make. And it was an oversight on our part. So I think it's important to understand which areas you need to keep exclusively for members and which areas you're going to invite other people in to come and witness the magic that is within your community and showcase that.
Brilliant. Right. Thank you so much, Taz, for your time today and sharing your experience with us. We're now going to switch over to our next speaker. I'm just going to put my screen on. So our next speakers, we have two. We have Helen and Kat, who are coming to talk to us about how they have built the Why Mums Don't Jump community. So Helen is a former BBC journalist and has created the ARIA-nominated stigma-busting podcast, Why Mums Don't Jump. And Kat Pearson is a lead service designer here at Idean. And my computer's being very slow as I try to load up the title page. But yeah, and Kat has been working with Helen on building up the community and building up the podcast with Helen. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand over to them so you can hear their story.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for having us. I'm going to bring Kat in shortly to talk a bit about building the brand. But first, I'm going to talk a bit about my wonky pelvic floor and a podcast that has brought together a community around prolapse, incontinence and pelvic pain, conditions that are estimated to affect 1 in 3 women, but are so taboo and isolating that most of us don't even know they exist. So the podcast is it's a mix of women's stories and expert voices, and I should be able to give you a flavour of it.
So I had to crawl back into bed, trying to figure out what just happened. How is this happening to me? You know, I'm 31 years old and I'm wetting the bed. What is this? I'm getting quite emotional even thinking back to this, because I was lying on the table and it was the first time I'd sort of been apart from my son for a long period of time. I mean, I know I'd done that shift at work, but I don't know, because it was to do with him and his birth. And I thought, am I ever going to be normal again?
One of the girls said to me, go in front of the mirror when you get home and say the words vagina, vulva, clitoris, orgasm, discharge, and say it again and again and again until you don't feel uncomfortable.
Head towards your feisty old crone. So be a feisty young woman, you know, be feisty. I do think this is about, you know, really, if we stop long enough, we do know our bodies, don't we?
I did get the mirror out the other day. Today, actually, I don't know. I thought, I'm going to have a look to see if, does it look any worse? I don't think it did, so that was good after having a baby.
Is that the first look you've had in 3 months?
Yeah, probably.
Whoa.
Maybe once before. Yeah, I know. I had to ban all the mirrors.
Right, I'm going to take you back to the beginning a little bit, because I knew next to nothing about any of this before it happened to me. So we've all got a pelvic floor, yes, all the men as well, which is sort of this hammock of very clever muscles that, amongst other things, support your pelvic organs. So in women, that's going to be your bladder, your bowel, your uterus, and it can become damaged or weakened, especially under the strain of pregnancy and childbirth. Also through menopause, sometimes high impact exercise, various ways. And when it does go wrong, it can lead to problems like incontinence. And by that, I mean leaking a bit of wee when you sneeze, to having no control. Pelvic pain, which is often when the muscles get too tight, or pelvic organ prolapse, which is where the pelvic organs aren't supported anymore and they sort of fall out of place, which is what happened to me. There is no magic pill for any of this, or women often feel like they've been fobbed off with a kind of, you've had a baby, what do you expect? There are treatment options. Pelvic physiotherapy can help, or depending on your situation, there's surgery, but that carries risks and it can be short-lived. There are some interesting developments happening in the femtech industry, which could make a real difference for some, but there's still work to be done there. So that's kind of like the physical side of it. And then there's the emotional impact. You learn to fear movement in case you make it worse, lifting, carrying your baby, exercising. You mourn for the loss of the person that you were and this running, jumping, carefree mum that you imagined you'd be. You get angry, you blame yourself, and you can't talk about it because it's all just too shameful and taboo. One study found that women with pelvic floor problems were 3 times more likely to have symptoms of depression. So it is hard, and I struggled and I couldn't find any decent information or support, just a lot of deep, dark online rabbit holes. So I don't even know why, but I decided to share my story on Instagram, and I realized very quickly that I was far from alone. There are loads of women suffering in silence, confused, anxious, and too embarrassed to seek help. So I started the podcast to try to change that. Now, my background is in radio, so I understand the power of the human story. But even so, the response to this has blown me away. It's something about knowing that you're not alone in the world and hearing others express your unspoken thoughts and fears. It's not going to fix you, it can't do that, but it can help to share the load, and that's massive. And the great thing about communities is that they have this way of taking on a life of their own. So my story reached women from all over the world, of all ages and backgrounds, who in some cases have even formed little pop clubs, we call them, pelvic organ prolapse, where they sort of meet up in real life and have a beer or whatever it is. And for me, listening to this whole community, being part of it, has helped me to expand and diversify the stories that I share. It did begin with my experience, but it's now this rich mix of narratives, including older women who are excited to hear a younger generation speaking out, and insight as well into other cultures who maybe aren't able to be so vocal. The vibe is very much a positive one, where people inspire each other to do more, to find a way back to fitness, to shout about it, to laugh about it. And of course, the other magic of communities is that with this kind of support, you can really make some noise and bring things to another level in ways you never expected. So I'm going to hand you over now to Kat, who was originally a listener and still is, and I think, and she offered her design skills to really elevate the brand for series 2.
I am still a listener. Hi. So yeah, when I stumbled on Helen's podcast, I was a new mum too, and I'd also had a prolapse as well. And at the time, I just had loads of pelvic pain, and I was really uncomfortable all of the time. And the podcast really helped me to get out of a bad headspace. I laughed, I definitely cried, but it also made me realize how angry I was feeling. Angry really because at the time I'd just gone back to work from maternity leave, sort of back to my normal life. And I was still telling loads of people that I had a sore back just because people's faces looked so awkward when I tried to explain the full details of what was wrong. All of the prolapse support groups and forums that I'd found online were pretty dull, really clinical, and just full of sadness. And I think when I listened to Helen's podcast, her tone of voice was just so different to anything else in this space. It was funny, it was real, and it was honest. I think definitely one of the best things about being a designer is that you really do have a little bit of power to help change perceptions. And it can be really easy to forget that, I think, especially when you're working a full-time job in the industry. I know that I kind of had. But anyway, I reached out to Helen on the off chance that she'd be interested in having me to help out, because I just saw this amazing opportunity to bring that tone of voice out of the podcast and really explode it out to a full-blown visual brand identity. I really just want to make people curious enough to sit down and listen to the podcast. Helen and I hooked up over Zoom, and this was back during the first lockdown, and we just did a little brand workshop together. So straight away we started to map out the big challenges that the brand needed to tackle, the stigma, the lack of good information, the really bad access to healthcare for women. And we just did some ideation exercises and had a bit of fun with it. And the brand personality that we ended up coming up with to fight these challenges definitely took inspiration from everything from Helen's love of disco music to animal prints to other stuff. But it really just felt like the best way to tackle this difficult, depressing topic was just buckets of energy and positivity and some really bold fonts. And the worst thing about having a pelvic floor problem for sure is that it's just totally invisible. And in reaction to that, I really just wanted to create a brand that was as noisy and as loud and as proud as possible. And then just to say the illustrations. So the best part of this process for me has really been this illustration work that I did. And the stories being told in the podcast tackle a lot of really sensitive, personal subject matter. And the podcast, while it does encourage people to speak out, it's also really important to respect that some people in these situations just are more comfortable staying anonymous. So illustration gave us a really great route to sort of showcase those stories and without needing to plaster people's photos all over social media. My own illustration style has always been pretty rough and ready. I'll make no apologies there, but in a way that sort of made it even more perfect for celebrating all of those wonky body bits that you're left with after having a kid. So I just sort of embraced it and went for it. And then I think from there, the rest was history, really. Helen did some user testing with mums down the park and the playground. Her brilliant husband built the website, and we launched the new brand at the start of series 2. Helen had a real smasher of a guest episode with Emma Barnett from BBC Women's Hour, and it's all just gotten a really amazing response from there.
I've been really lucky. It's a passion project. It's obviously a really personal project, and a lot of what has worked has been really organic. The second series ended a couple of weeks ago with the podcast at number 3 in the Apple parenting charts. It was recently nominated for an ARIA, which is kind of like the Oscars of radio in the UK. And it was picked up by The Guardian, which has been another incredible boost. So it's going from strength to strength beyond anything I could ever have imagined. And I have high hopes for the third series. So watch this space.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for sharing this story and journey. The love on the chat is huge. And I need to say quickly, I'm sorry, I missed some of the questions, or I missed the questions in the chat as after Taz finished speaking. So Fuzzy, sorry about that. I just didn't see them. Taz, I think, has been answering some of them in the chat. And if there's any unanswered ones, let's pick them up at the end. So apologies. I won't do that this time. So please put your questions in for Helen and Kat now, and I'll ask only one whilst they're coming in. Okay, so I won't miss any more questions, and have to be conscious of time as well. But so the organic growth now, the community has been amazing. But what does growing the community further look like for you? How do you separate that from the podcast?
Kat knows this is a really tricky one for me. The podcast and the community around it are very linked. They've grown up together, and I guess I'm hoping that they're going to continue to grow together. As I said, it's still very much a passion project, so there is a limit to what I can do. But ultimately, I want Why Mums Don't Jump to reach as many women as need it. And I've seen a lot of growth happening recently outside of the UK, which is really exciting. And I'd love for that to continue. And yeah, there'll be another series. I have some thoughts as well about a couple of other things I'd like to see happen, and hopefully Kat's going to be on board for us, so we'll see about that. And then the question for me is probably more about how I sustain it all going forwards, and I haven't quite figured that out yet. And I found what Taz was saying very useful and interesting. I need to have a think about it. Yeah.
Great. So I'm gonna keep going with my other question because I haven't seen any others come up just yet. But so you've created the community around a very personal experience that you had. So how did you kind of manage to keep it open to others who may have had slightly different experiences to you, but still in the same realm as it grew?
So yeah, it did begin with my story. The first thing I did on the Instagram account was to share that, but it really quickly became clear that it wasn't just about me. So the podcast was always going to be about sharing a mix of stories, because I guess I see it more as a resource, and I want it to reflect different people's experiences that everyone can relate to. And it wasn't easy, obviously, to get people to talk about this to start with. It's still not, just because of the nature of it. But people did, and some of them came directly from the community, like Jan, who you will have heard earlier, who's like 65 and sent me quite a loud message telling me not to forget about older women, and she was right, and she was great. And there was a lot of chat on Instagram the other week about pessaries, which are kind of like a plastic device that can help support a prolapse. So we did an episode on that. So it's it's kind of like a circular thing. I do feed from the community and vice versa. And as Taz was saying as well, I am constantly trying to branch out beyond that bubble, because I know, we can just talk to ourselves about these things. So I do talk to other mums that I know, and the wider pelvic health community of physios or fitness professionals. It's a work in progress, but I like that idea of spreading roots.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for sharing your story with us today. And it's really inspiring for our next and final session for today. So I mentioned a little bit at the beginning that we want to get your input. So we want to build an inclusive design meetup and an inclusive design community. And let me switch to Mentimeter. We're going to ask you a couple of questions. It's really low effort, no cameras on. We're just going to ask you a couple of questions that will help us build a view as to what would be a useful way for us to set up an inclusive design community. So bear with me 1 minute whilst I get Mentimeter up. So whilst I'm getting it up, it'd be great if you could grab your phone and get ready to use Mentimeter. It's very straightforward. I will explain how we do it. Now, give me 1 second. Okay, I hope everyone can now see hello. At the top, there should be a link, so you can see menti.com. Actually, I can see it's just loading. And there should be a code. Just waiting for that to load. Okay, hope you can now see it. So let me flick through. So this is Mentimeter, and then at the top there is the link and the code that you need to put in on to be able to answer our questions. So as I was saying earlier, at the very beginning, we want to design products and services that benefit as many people as possible. And we think creating an inclusive design meetup or community is one way that will help, and feels like one of the next steps on our mission. So because we are inclusive and speaking to a captive audience, hopefully, we thought we'd get your views on that. And so the aim of it is to build a diverse and engaged community. So we want to welcome people who want to learn more and share their experiences with others, and to drive the practice. So work with others so that we can all build awareness and get more products and services out there and designed. So that's the kind of aim. And as I said at the beginning, we are still learning about how we drive our inclusive design practice all the time. So this is a very initial aim, and this will all evolve as we work through and work out what's the best way to do this. And then our intentions. So similarly, our intentions are initial intentions. They will undoubtedly evolve, but what we do want it to be is a relevant and engaging community that is creating a sense of belonging for people who want to join it and is inclusive by example. So as I was also saying earlier, that we want to get feedback in terms of how we make things as inclusive and accessible as we can, and we're really keen to kind of get your input on that and how we can be inclusive by example. These sessions have to be practical and effective. Look, you're very busy. How do you make these sessions effective so that it's equipping everyone with tools, techniques to make changes in their day-to-day work so they can see the visible impact that they're having through designing more inclusively. And also we kind of feel it's got to be measurable so that we can start to understand the impact of the things that we're doing together and ensuring that there is impact. So now we just need your help. We've got a couple of questions, really not that many, to get your thoughts on this. So the first question, my computer is clearly getting slower as the rain comes down. So first question is starting with what would spark your interest. So what is it that would motivate you or interest you? Or what is it that you want to get out of an inclusive design meetup? So when we ask you, this question, what pops into your brain? What are your expectations? So this is the first question in the Mentimeter. So for those of you, so I can't see unfortunately directly what is happening coming up because of my screen share, but is it working? Can you just let me know in the chat if you're able to answer the questions? Is that working now? Yes, it's working. Okay, good. Right, so as I was saying before, what pops into your brain? What are your expectations? Great, we can see them coming up. Okay. Switching some tabs here. Yeah, this is all really helpful. Yeah, I think meeting people outside design is really interesting. I think that's something we'd want to tackle with this. How do we encourage a broader range and we're not just in a little echo chamber? Real life examples, absolutely. Mentoring, yeah, that's a really good one. Practical, definitely. Oh, these are all brilliant. Thank you so much for your inputs. They're all kind of, yeah, common pitfalls and things a team can do to be more inclusive aware. Yeah, I think that's a really good one. And there's lots of sessions that we could share based on our learnings. But I think not just on our learnings, it'd be really interesting to make it very broad and have lots of speakers and come and share their experiences too. Because as I keep on seem to saying, we're learning as we go on this. Yeah, just so much for us to go and process, so that is brilliant. I'll give you a bit more time to answering because I can see all the answers keep on coming up. Give you 30 more seconds to put your answers in. Great. Okay. Just in the interest of time, and I don't want to take up too much of your Wednesdays, I'll keep going. But thank you so much. These are all super interesting and really useful. Next question that we wanted to ask you is on, is inspiration. So we, in all the work that we do, like to look outside and take lots of inspiration from other industries, businesses, sectors. As part of our project work, it's a very natural thing to do. So we feel that we should be doing it here as well. I wanted to ask you, what's a really great meetup that you've been to? And this is not at all related to work. I think it's really important that we cast the net wide. When I ask you this question, what is the first thing that kind of pops into your mind of the best one? It could be a sports activity, it could be a hobby, it could also be work, it could be you know, related to NCT if we're building on the prolapse topic that Helen and Kat was just talking about. So literally any sort of meetup that you've been to before, what is a good example of one that you've really, really enjoyed? I'll give you a minute or so to add your answers in. Yay, there's a pie people. that's probably one of our team, but brilliant that that's there. Nice that Triangles has popped up. We used to, same with Muslim makers that Taz was talking about, we used to host some of their events in our studio back in the day. Nice. Can't remember what people, meeting people in real life is like. Yeah, well, you're definitely not the only one. Scroll down so you can start to see some more of the answers coming in. Oh, quite a few creative mornings coming up, which is interesting. Well, I'll give you 30 more seconds to add in your answers and then we'll move on to the next one. Oh. Yeah, the responses are staying static. So let's go to the next one. Okay, so just to build on that, it's great that they're the best meetup that you've been to. But what would be really good to know is what made it so great. Obviously, it's good for us to go and have a look at these meetups that you've been to, and we'll go and investigate. But it would just be really helpful to understand what was it that made them so great for you, so that we can take some inspiration from those. I think some of you already gave some answers to this in the previous one, so I'll just wait a couple of seconds longer. Here's the word cloud coming now. Making something together is really nice, and that's something that's related to one of our next questions, because we would like to actually do things and make things as an outcome or output to this. I think it'd be nice if it was something that where we didn't only do talking, but also created things as well. Sense of belonging, yeah, that's really nice, based on what, also building on what Enrico was talking. Organize what corporate, absolutely. Yeah, common goals and values. I think learning from what Taz was telling us earlier about how we set those right from the very beginning. Vegan snacks, yeah, noted. We normally have very good snacks and food when we run our events in the studio, so that's something that we can look forward to in the future. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. Got loads of brilliant responses there. Thank you, everybody. Okay, question on the vibes. So what would be really helpful for us to know is level of engagement. So this is the penultimate question and then we're done. But it'd be really good to get an idea of what sort of interaction you want with this meetup. So is it events with speakers similar to Pi People? Is it a Slack community such as Slack? Is it a newsletter on a certain, monthly or however frequently? And then working sessions and hackathons. So as I was just saying earlier, that's something that we're very interested to hear your views on, whether that be something that you're interested in. I can see that it's moving around. Yeah, so in the ranking, hackathons and working sessions are at the top. That's really interesting. I think given the community and those in the event today, that's not surprising. See, events with speakers is moving up and down with chat community as well. I'll give it another couple of seconds to see where it settles out, and then we'll move on to the final question. Okay, well, final bits of movement, very close between first and second. Okay, that is really helpful. Really good indication of what you would look for. Okay, final question for this evening, and thank you for sticking with us. I know we're slightly over. Question is, what shall we fix first? So we want this to be a meetup or community that has measurable outcomes, as I said earlier. So let's look at things that we can work on to improve the inclusivity around the products and the services that we think need help. So is it a specific group of user needs, a community that's underrepresented, a specific product and service that needs improving? What, for example, the support that women who have prolapse receive. So what is it that you would like us to have a look at as a group first? Hopefully Menti is allowing you to put some answers in. Yes, they're starting to come through. I think we could have a really broad remit. I mean, there's no fixed parameters in which we want to work within as we're looking to fix things. Yeah, London centricity is a really interesting one. Integrated translation feature, yeah, great. Yeah, the credit rating system and how that doesn't work for people, for example, who are freelance, yeah, really good one. That's actually similar to a piece of work we have explored in the past. PMDD. Yeah, it's really nice that everyone is showing. This is so broad. This is exactly what we were hoping for. Brilliant. Scroll down so you can see the answers. Right. thank you so much for all of these. This is just such brilliant content. We're really, really grateful. I'm going to leave that rolling, and please keep on submitting your answers and your thoughts as to what we can fix first. I think we could create a really interesting, diverse and inclusive community for inclusive design, and we could do some great things. Even if we begin on just one of these ideas, we could have some really positive impact on a lot of people. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Taz, Helen and Kat, for your time and sharing your stories and your learnings, which have been just fascinating. And thank you for participating, giving your inputs into the Mentimeter survey. What we're going to do is, after this, we're going to send out an email asking you if you want to be part of that community, and then we can add you to the list. And then also, if anyone has any particular thoughts, comments, feedback on our approach to inclusive design, but also the meetup or the community that we'd like to build, please just drop me an email. I'll put it in the chat, but we would love to hear from you. So thank you very much for your time today, and have a good rest of your evening, afternoon, morning. I can see we've got people joining us from all over, so from wherever you are in the world, have a good rest of your day.